Previously, we saw the rise of landscape and genre painting after the Reformation, from Bosch's imaginative depictions of the fiery pits of hell to Bruegel's relatable genre works showing the lives of the common people. In this chapter, we'll witness the development of another new idiosyncratic style beginning in Italy and later spreading throughout Europe, that sought to disturb the artistic status quo by exaggerating and twisting high Renaissance ideals. Balance and symmetry no longer satisfied artists who were hungry for new approaches and new methods. The product of their experimentation was Mannerism. Raphael's death in 1520 marked the end to an era when graceful forms and perfect proportions ruled supreme. An era that began when Brunelleschi first laid down the rules of linear perspective, the perspective that defined Quattrocento Italian painting and culminated in the High Renaissance. Sebastiano del Piombo's arrival in Rome from Venice had already led to a stylistic shift in Raphael's work. His graceful sprezzatura, the optimistic and easygoing nature of his style, wholly disappeared. He began to deviate from the divine beauty and Neoplatonic perfection of the school of Athens, foreshadowing the development of the Mannerist movement. Raphael's legacy as the cultured prince of painters would live on, but only as an artifact to be admired, rather than an influence to be adopted. Artists in Florence and Rome would search for ways to transcend the classical perfection embodied by Raphael's art. These efforts were reflected in increasingly unconventional works that didn't seek to be naturalistic or idealistic, just the opposite. An excellent representative of this proto-Mannerist style is a painter named Rosso Fiorentino, the Red Florentine, due to his hair. Rosso's altarpiece of the Descent dates to 1521, just 1 year after Raphael's death. It's his masterpiece, and yet I think it's a deeply uncomfortable scene to behold. It's tightly packed with no clear compositional scheme, not quite pyramidal, not quite symmetrical. There's no linear perspective. We're in a shallow space. And the lowering of Christ from the cross here is not in the least a graceful act. The warm color palette is almost expressionist. It's an emotional release of agitation and anxiety. And overall, the altarpiece is messy and confused. The rigid classicism and geometric perfection of the High Renaissance has vanished altogether. Divine beauty was no longer a priority for artists like Rosso. He's opted for a very theatrical portrayal of this descent. And it really allows him to convey the intensity and the drama of this scene with a new level of immediacy. Rosso had the ability to create visually confusing works that somehow retain a very straightforward monumentality. You can hardly tell what's going on in this composition, but looking closely, you find a certain degree of organization. And firstly, the composition itself is pyramidal. with Moses at the center, about to deliver a violent coup de grace to this unfortunate man. Several more have surrendered or died. The one on the right can be seen screaming out in agony. All are nude. And then there's a group of horrified women in the background watching them skirmish. This is a scene from the Old Testament in which the prophet Moses defends the daughters of a priest named Jethro. They're fetching water when a group of shepherds attempt to rob that water to feed their own animals. And you can see them behind the figure of Moses, those sheep. We think that Rosso Fiorentino saw the cartoons for the unfinished battle frescoes of Leonardo and Michelangelo in Florence, because he certainly derived elements from both masters. The nude, muscular bodies are unquestionably from Michelangelo, whose Sistine ceiling Rosso also saw in Rome. But the animation and the storytelling technique, that sense of urgency and agitation, that is from Leonardo's Battle of Anghiari. But Rosso's incorporation of that into this new experimental genre is absolutely groundbreaking. Rosso had established himself in Rome when the city was sacked in 1527. He then left the panicked city, like many other artists, in search of a more stable environment for work. And after sending this very picture of Moses defending Jethro's daughters to King François I of France, the same François who hosted Leonardo a decade earlier, Rosso was invited to the French royal court. François I was generally a well-liked king who established strategic alliances, most notably with the Ottoman Empire, in response to the territorial ambitions of the rival Holy Roman Empire. He brought Italian humanism to his court, spurring the French Renaissance, and alongside the introduction of Italian art, he promoted the French language as the official replacement to Latin. This likeness by the portraitist Jean Clouet shows François as a trendsetter in fashion, rather than a king in his royal garb. He wears this beautiful overcoat, this manteau, with flared sleeves over this quilted pourpoint type of doublet. And we see his crown not on his head, but on this exquisitely rendered crimson damask backdrop. This type of damask, this silk fabric, would have been manufactured most likely in Italy or later in Spain, where weavers imitated the highly classified techniques of leading Florentine and Lucchese textile workshops. Now, François, like his great Tudor rivals in England at this point, Henri VIII, absolutely loved textiles and tapestries because of their extravagance and luxury. They were status symbols, affordable only for the wealthiest of the wealthiest. Nobles spent fortunes on them. Royals collected them from the most prolific workshops for tapestry in Brussels and Paris, and for other textiles in Florence, Lucca, and later on the Iberian Peninsula. In 1520, Henri VIII and François I met in France to promote peace between the two states in response to the threats of the Holy Roman Empire. And it was a real showdown between the two luxury-loving, competitive kings, so much so that it was called the Field of the Cloth of Gold, for the golden textiles that both kings wore and brought to the show made it more of a chance to show off than a diplomatic summit. And in this tapestry from a private collection, you can see François I actually holding a cloth of gold at the right edge. François situated his court in Paris, where he restored the Louvre Palace as we know it today, and built a series of dazzling chateaux, again in his quest for luxury. Tapestries were also popular because they kept out the cold in the often very cold palaces and chateaux. Like other textiles, tapestries were quite thick, designed to withstand repeated installation and transportation from place to place, wherever the king needed to impress guests or make a palace comfortable. Rosso Fiorentino, upon his arrival in France, was tasked with decorating one such royal manor, the chateau at Fontainebleau, just outside Paris, previously a Gothic hunting lodge that had just been recently refurbished by François I. With a group of fellow painters and sculptors, Rosso designed a massive, ostentatious hall with opulent gold decoration and sculptural programming that's known as the Gallery of François I. You see paintings, sculpture, wood paneling, gilding, really a combination of so many media, and this type of courtly splendor was incredibly valued by the king, who was eager to outcompete the decor at other European courts, like that of Henry VIII. The elephant here is a symbol of power, not only because of its size and monumentality, but also its exotic origins, suggesting that France was international and commercially successful. And so this sort of integration of Italian Mannerism and sumptuous decorative arts established a general style of French art known as the First School of Fontainebleau. That, in turn, spurred the development of Northern Mannerism, in which French, Flemish, and German artists produced unique and independent interpretations of the Italian Mannerist idiom. Later in France, the style even found itself being applied to furniture under one of François' successors, Henri II, embellishment and ornamentation. Look at the disproportionate sizes of those figures supporting the columns called caryatids in comparison to the figures in the central paneling. Another very popular but often overlooked art form in mid-16th century France was enamel and enameled decorative arts. And here we're talking about vitreous enamel, which is essentially powdered glass in various colors that is fused to a metal substrate, in these cases often copper, by firing at high temperatures. Basically, it's like painting, but instead of oil on panel, it was colored enamels on copper. And the center of painted enamel production was Limoges, roughly in central France. This is a casket or jewelry box in the grisaille enamel technique, so it's done in tones of gray. That was achieved by first firing a layer of very dark vitreous enamel, like a very dark blue, and then adding the white on top. In this case, producing 4 panels, one on each face, featuring Sibyls, mythical prophetesses who foretold the coming of Christ. And this grisaille style was probably inspired by black and white prints, another example of dialogue between media. Notice, though, the abundance of ornamentation and gold gilding on this casket. The grisaille may seem simplistic, but look at the detail with which the figures are rendered. There are even inscriptions and physical attributes identifying each Sibyl. Clearly there's an interest in making this quite the stylish and polished objet d'art, showing off not only the status of the owner, but also the opulence of the treasures, the jewels that it would have once held. And so this can be considered a type of Mannerist decoration. In Germany, the first Mannerist was perhaps the eccentric Hans Baldung, nicknamed Grien because of his love for the color green. But Baldung's Mannerism reflects more of the religious upheaval and social uncertainty surrounding the Reformation at the time. It echoes the anxiety felt by people who began questioning their faith and their beliefs. So it's difficult to assess the impact of Italian influence on his work, but it's certainly compelling to think that his style developed rather independently, of course, with the influence of native German artists like Grunewald. Baldung was from Strasbourg, but he was actually trained in Nuremberg by Dürer in chiaroscuro printmaking. So one of his first independent projects, this woodcut of a witch's sabbath in which witches assemble in satanic worship. And indeed, Baldung was known for his obsession with witchcraft. He regularly depicted witches in woodcuts and also paintings. Here he's included 3 witches on a New Year's greeting card, a rather strange choice, predictably very disturbing for its recipient. There's a painting with 2 nude witches manipulating the weather, which was said to be one of their magical capabilities. You can see the witch on our right holding a potion there. And already he's disregarding human anatomical proportion completely, preferring these voluptuous nudes and more curvilinear forms as opposed to any sort of classicizing idealism. And the exaggeration and expressionist palette of Mannerism simply served as a means to his end of depicting the strange and the macabre. Like Grunewald, Baldung loved disturbing and morbid subjects, but he put his own weird erotic twist. Here, Baldung portrays a nude damsel in distress, tears streaming down her face, with the skeletal figure of death pulling on her hair. Death is inevitably approaching. And above them, an inscription reads, "Here you must go." In the pendant panel, we see that Our Lady is standing on her own gravestone. She's now leaning back reluctantly to receive death's fatal kiss. Her soul is being sucked out of her body. This is a morbid memento mori, communicating to us the inevitability of death, but it has this unsettling eroticism that feels deeply inappropriate considering the gravity of the subject. The stark contrast in coloration between her ghostly pale body and death's rotting brown flesh is disturbing. There is an expressionist feel to the work, and also an absurd, cathartic emotionalism. And in conjunction with the voluptuous, sinuous bodies, Baldung is placed among the Mannerists. Back in Rosso's native Italy, the sack of Rome has turned the world upside down. And the Italian wars that began with the death of Lorenzo the Beneficent and the collapse of the Peace of Lodi and the Italic League were still raging on. Fundamentally, there were conflict between the Habsburg-ruled Holy Roman Empire and an assortment of neighboring states, all alienated by imperial encroachment. France, the Papal States, Venice, Milan, and Florence. The sack of Rome was but one piece in the much larger and more complex puzzle of land claims and territorial disputes in 16th century Europe. But eventually Charles V succeeded in his campaigns, defeating the French at Naples and spurring a slew of treaties that ended the war. Florence, already experiencing an identity crisis of its own, did not want to involve itself in these wars or the treaties. After the Medici had been expelled in 1494, the family had gained power in Rome. There were a string of Medici popes who entered the Vatican, including Leo X, who was, in fact, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. 2 popes down, Clement VII, also a Medici, realized that he could reinstitute Medici rule in the Republic of Florence, then under Piero Soderini. He enlisted the help of other armies, and with Spanish assistance, he laid siege to Republican Florence for almost a whole year in the hope that he could replant his family dynasty there. In this portrait, we see a young man, probably just a teenager, holding a halberd, a formidable weapon with a spear at one end and an axe at the other. He's probably a youth, defending the city walls. We can see a fortification behind him during the siege. He would have been too young to formally enlist in the Florentine army, but there's no doubt that he's determined to patrol and defend his city. He stands tall and triumphant, unafraid of what's to come, looking directly at us with one hand on his hip, where he's stowed another sword. But in 1530, the Republic surrendered to the siege, opening its doors once more to the Medici. Once revered as the great fathers of the city, they now returned as hereditary monarchs, unwelcomed by much of the citizenry. Clement VII had them made dukes of Florence, no longer de facto rulers, but monarchs imposed on the people. And now, looking at this image of a fearless young man in retrospect, with the knowledge that his efforts would fail, that the Republic would fall, adds a whole new level of emotional meaning. At once, it becomes a deeply moving picture. This constant political back and forth was more of a continuity for Florence than anything else. Ever since Savonarola proclaimed himself the spiritual leader of the city in 1494, Florence had been tossed around in a rally between republican rule and aristocratic rule, generating a divide among the population. Some were adamant on staying true to the city's democratic values. Piero Soderini's rule taught them that total republicanism, which hadn't been seen since the revolt of the Ciompi, was possible and viable. When the Medici began rising to power once more, Florentines then began to see the family as tyrants, wanting to establish a permanent ruling dynasty that would uproot the city's democratic ideals. And in a sense, they weren't wrong. After all, the new Medici dukes no longer enjoyed the popularity that Cosimo Pater Patriae once had, so they became increasingly paranoid about their position. As soon as they took over, they tightened their grip by signing a new constitution that solidified their power. Their banking enterprise would never return. The Medici Bank had collapsed with Lorenzo's death. But that was okay, because they were now full-time politicians. The Florentine diplomat Niccolò Machiavelli had just published The Prince, a treatise on political science and the philosophy for leadership. It was meant for Medici reading, and in it he emphasizes that for leaders, the ends justify the means. Securing power and glory, he said, is the ultimate goal of a prince, and whatever can be done to reach that goal should be done. He famously wrote, "It is better to be feared than to be loved, if one cannot be both." Another popular text by the diplomat Baldassare Castiglione, here painted by Raphael, sought to describe the ideal qualities of a courtier or court attendant by nostalgically hearkening back to the small Italian courts of the Quattrocento. It became a reference text for those who wanted positions close to the new ruling class of Italy. Outward beauty, Castiglione wrote, is a true sign of inner goodness. This loveliness, indeed, is impressed upon the body in varying degrees as a token by which the soul can be recognized for what it is, just as with trees, the beauty of the blossom testifies to the goodness of the fruit. The writings of these two individuals were certainly followed by the Medici dukes, and their beliefs certainly reflected in contemporary artwork. Indeed, the very purpose of art would change. Portraiture now became a propagandistic genre, used frequently by the Medici to advertise or glorify their image. Alessandro de Medici, the first of the dukes, was born out of wedlock and known for his dark skin, his mother supposedly being an African servant in the household. So predictably, his rise to power wasn't without disagreement from within the family. He favored Pontormo, the Mannerist from just outside Florence, whose portrait of Alessandro depicts him as a calm and reserved young man sketching in a studiolo. A new group of artists, all Mannerists, would be employed at the new Medici court, which regained its Quattrocento status as the arbiter of taste. Republican painters like Michelangelo faded from prominence. He eventually fled to Rome. And in this sense, Italian Mannerism really developed alongside the new Florentine state. Pontormo's work marks a decisive shift from the dignified classicism of the High Renaissance, with the complete abandonment of perspectival depth and anatomical realism, in favor of bright, contrasting colors and exaggerated bodily forms interlocked in action. He completes the transition that Rosso Fiorentino had started years earlier. Christ is supported seemingly effortlessly by two figures, one of whom stands on the tips of his toes. It's an anatomically impossible position. There's a total disregard for anatomy and proportion. A group of blue-cloaked figures in the background, one of whom is the swooning, grief-stricken Mary, surround Christ's drooping body in mourning. Beside them, on the right-hand edge of the panel, Pontormo has included what is likely a self-portrait, gazing out at us as if to invite the viewer's sympathy and commiseration. We're situated in a somber, shallow space with garish, complementary colors that lacks all signs of life. In this sense, it's reminiscent of Grunewald, convergent stylistic evolution. The curvilinear outlines of the figures trace out a circular composition. Their overlapping forms and exaggerated, contorted anatomies are quintessentially Mannerist. Their limbs outstretched in dramatic, theatrical positions, their heads slanted at unnatural angles. Notably, the center of the composition is left empty, occupied only by a confused dance of outreached arms, accentuating the sense of emptiness and devastation. Pontormo asks us to follow the undulating rhythms of those arms, leading us back into a perpetual circle perhaps a circle of life, suggestive of Christ's resurrection. Following the sack of Rome, Roman workshops like Raphael's were largely disbanded due to the lack of patronage, which usually is associated with political stability. Pupils and assistants in large studios scattered. Raphael's most talented assistant, Giulio, had just finished frescoing the remaining 2 Raphael rooms that the master himself never finished before his death. And following the sacking, he too fled the city, but he was lucky enough to have found work at the Gonzaga court in Mantua, where Mantegna had worked in the Quattrocento, and there he acquired the name Giulio Romano, the Roman. Giulio Romano had strayed from Raphael's classicism and adopted the now fashionable Mannerist style. He was commissioned by the Marquis of Mantua to design and decorate a country palace, and he ambitiously applied experimental Mannerist principles to both the architecture and the interior decoration. The product is this bizarre but compelling structure, the Palazzo Te, with a facade that reminds of the classical, but a courtyard that truly evades categorization. You can see truly strange masonry with the bricks projecting out like reliefs, not exactly pleasing to the eye, with large, exaggerated spaces or mortar joints between each brick, too. He's included gabled windows and Doric columns to complete this densely packed wall. And most strangely, on the frieze, or the strip running across the top of the building, there are individual tablets that aren't level with the others. They're dropping, as if someone has slid them slightly down, leaving this deeply unsatisfying gap between the tops of those tridlifts and the cornice, or the top molding. You can see a normal classical frieze on the bottom, which feature these 3 striped tridlifts all level to one another. So Giulio Romano is really putting his own twist on classical architecture. He's twisting classical forms and exaggerating the masonry, which are hallmarks of Mannerism and Mannerist architecture. But Giulio Romano's real tour de force, I think, is inside the Palazzo Te, in a room frescoed from ceiling to bottom, with scenes of the Gigantomachy, the battle in Greek mythology between the giants and the gods of Olympus. And what Giulio Romano does so beautifully is a seamless integration of the imagery on the side walls into the beautiful, dramatic event on the ceiling. It's a trompe-l'oeil ceiling, a trick the eye effect. It's an optical illusion that makes it seem much taller than it actually is. This is undeniably the grandest work of Mannerist fresco. It's using di sotto in su, or seen from below, the same technique that Mantegna used in the oculus of the Camera degli Sposi, in which we're seeing this dramatic foreshortening of the figures to make it seem like we're really looking at them from this worm's eye view from the ground level. But Giulio Romano's is so much more dramatic. It's almost like a hallucinatory vision, an endless tunnel that pulls you in, engulfing you and bathing you in blinding rays of light that rain down through the heavy clouds, illuminating all the deities and divinities above. The otherworldly contrast and spectacular lighting is simply breathtaking. We see Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods, and the god of thunder, fighting off the attacking giants who are attempting to climb into the heavens by piling up stones. Jupiter is delivering a brutal strike of lightning toward that artificial mountain, sending stones flying left and right and paralyzing onlooking gods in admiration and shock. The agitation and drama is palpable. And it's very appropriate for a Mannerist to paint this picture because it's such an imaginative, action-packed fantasy, a genre that Giulio Romano certainly excels at. The giants here are truly massive. Jupiter, in fact, is disproportionately large. The rocks are all absurdly shaped. They actually resemble the bricks in the Palazzo courtyard. Realistic proportions and realistic spaces are out of the question altogether. This is a mythological battle scene where Giulio Romano can let his imagination roam free. But unbelievably, Giulio Romano's Mantuan masterpiece is not particularly well known. The artist himself is rarely discussed, so this is still a hidden gem. But the textbook Mannerist work also hails from northern Italy, from Parma, a city halfway between Milan and Florence. That's where Parmigianino, whose name means the little one from Parma, was a leading artist. Even in Parmigianino's earliest works, we see a curiosity and a desire for artistic experimentation. This self-portrait in a convex mirror was completed when he was just 21 years old. It was like an advertisement of his ability, a function comparable to Antonello's St. Jerome in his study. And already it's a study in distortion. It's an excellent preparatory work, I think, for his most renowned painting, which is truly textbook Mannerism and a perfect example of anatomical distortion, the Madonna of the long neck. And instantly, when we lay our eyes on this picture, we see that everything about this Madonna and Child is anatomically wrong. But from a far distance, it somehow looks elegantly right. Compositionally, it's a disaster. There's no coherent design to bind each element together. You have figures squished and packed into the lower left corner, and one single tiny figure of St. Jerome on the lower right. On some figures, there's absolutely no sensitivity to musculature. On the Christ Child, it's excessive. And both Mary and Christ are much too elongated. Mary's head is too small in comparison to her massive body. Her long neck and sinuous body are unmistakably Mannerist, her fingers long and slender. They're also curved, there's no joints or bones. They look way too smooth and supple. Her torso is twice as wide as her upper body, which also accommodates for the equally massive Christ Child, who looks as if he's been horizontally stretched. And it's difficult to even articulate exactly what's wrong with his anatomy. It's rather difficult to pinpoint. There seem to be multiple joints where it's gone wrong, not least the elbow. And the width of his left hand is half the girth of his wrist. But in combination, and especially from afar, there's a strange, exaggerated monumentality and elegance to this work. Everything is so wrong that it somehow all seems so right. With Rosso Fiorentino in France, Pontormo in Florence, and Giulio Romano and Parmigianino in northern Italy, early Mannerism reached its height in the 1530s. But it would be transformed and its trajectory redirected once more by another political event in 1537, spurring another phase of the Mannerist style in a more mature and more intellectually sophisticated manner. And the center of that development would once again be in Florence. In 1537, Alessandro de Medici was assassinated by a close friend who wanted the Medici out of power. All of his children were illegitimate, and he too had been an illegitimate child. So one can understand the division and discontent with his rise to power, both among the Florentine population and within his own family. The panicked Medici advisors wanted to prevent civil unrest and quickly institute a new leader, and from many possible candidates, they selected the 17-year-old Cosimo I de Medici, Cosimo I, not to be confused with Cosimo the Elder, who had established de facto rule over Florence in 1434. Many were disillusioned by his appointment. He was so young. They thought he was naive and untrained, maybe easily manipulable. He was from a minor branch of the Medici family, and he had never even lived in Florence. Indeed, the primary motivation for his selection was so that aristocrats who wanted power could govern through him, or so they thought. Little did they know that they had chosen an astute and intelligent leader who would never allow himself to be exploited. Even at 19 years old, the age at which he's portrayed here by Pontormo, Cosimo I was not going to be a pawn. He was determined to wield total power. He would go on to secure an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire and realize a centuries-old dream by successfully conquering the Republic of Siena, achieving total hegemony over Tuscany. Here he's portrayed by Bronzino in full armor as an alert and able military commander, a far cry from the young, learned, but maybe slightly shy youth that Pontormo painted 7 years prior. Bronzino was a pupil of Pontormo, who became the new favorite painter at Cosimo I's court. I'm showing you a contemporary suit of armor belonging to the Holy Roman Emperor, bearing many similarities to the one you see Cosimo wearing. Nonetheless, Cosimo had a tenuous claim to the throne, and that would haunt him throughout his reign. So he tightened his grip. He established the Uffizi, or the offices, today the Galleria degli Uffizi, to tighten his administrative grip on the guilds. He built a secret passageway from the Palazzo Vecchio, the town hall, to the Palazzo Pitti, one of the Medici palaces, because he didn't feel safe making the journey through the city streets, lest he suffer the same fate as his predecessor, Alessandro. But Cosimo's ducal power would be secured when he married a Spanish aristocrat, Eleonora of Toledo, who was initially rejected by the Florentines as an outsider, but later loved for her charity, business acumen, and political prowess. She often ruled as a regent and became, in effect, the first modern First Lady. Here, Bronzino paints Eleonora with her son, Giovanni, the heir to the ducal throne, against a stately background of dark royal blue. She's spotlit, dressed in a beautiful silk velvet gown with pearl necklaces and a belt of gold, from which extends a tassel. Bronzino uses a Mannerist approach to figure with the same boneless fingers as in Parmigianino's Madonna. But he reveals himself to be an absolute master of naturalism, with the highlights on each bead and pearl, the sheen of the gold and the gemstones. He captures the smooth texture of the velvet. The child's robes, too, are highlighted with gold. Eleonora looks directly at us, her lips slightly upturned, her gaze benevolent and wise. The inclusion of her child, her heir, symbolizes the future of the Medici dynasty, a reinforcement of Medici dominance. And indeed, the family would rule Florence continuously until the 18th century. Bronzino's dignified royal portraits document the reign of Cosimo I. They were the elegant propaganda posters of Cinquecento Florence. Bronzino captured all the faces of the court. Here is sweet Bia, Cosimo's illegitimate but beloved daughter who died young from fever. Cosimo was known for employing 5 jesters at his court for entertainment. The most popular was Nano Morgante, a witty dwarf, portrayed here by Bronzino. It's a double-sided picture. On the recto, we see Morgante holding an owl on a leash. We know from documentation that the Medici court had him catch birds like the jay flying on the upper right, using predatory owls as a form of entertainment. The verso shows Morgante successful in that endeavor. This is Bronzino's response to Vasari's Paragone, the debate between painting and sculpture. Bronzino believed that painting could represent much more than a sculpture in the round. Not only was painting not limited to just one perspective, it was a more dynamic medium, as opposed to the static sculptural figure. Had this figure been sculpted, say in marble, we would only see one expression, one posture, and one scene, even if we were to move around the figure. But here, we see a chronological narrative. When we move to the reverse of the painting, we see a different scene altogether. So really, this whimsical depiction of Nano Morgante is both Bronzino's answer to the Paragone and a playful portrait that captures the lively spirit of the Medici court. The Mannerist exaggeration of classical forms in no way implies the decline of that classical influence in humanism. Artists were simply interested in expanding upon it. They didn't lose interest in it altogether. This was especially true in philosophy and literature. Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch, after 2 centuries, remained the most respected writers. Here they're reimagined by Giorgio Vasari himself. He was also competing for preeminence among the Mannerist painters, but he found more fame with his Vitae of 1550. The poets he shows here were still seen as the embodiment of Tuscan literary culture. They were the pride of Tuscany. And so new poets would continue looking to their old verses for inspiration. Poetry also inspired and necessitated new decorative arts. This is an inkstand from Urbino, the leading center of Maiolica production in 16th century Italy. It shows Apollo, the god of many arts, and the muses, who were considered inspirations for poets, engaged in a variety of performing arts on a multi-tiered inkstand, and the top could be opened to reveal the compartments you see. And you see a selection of instruments, scissors and such things, illustrated within each compartment, and that denoted what exactly went in each. So we can see that one is reading, and there on the book, actually, the work is dated 1584. The level of intricacy is incredible. One of the most prominent poets in the later 16th century was Laura Battiferri, whose Petrarchan sonnets were well renowned in her day, even in all male literary circles. Laura was the first woman accepted into an Italian scholarly academy. And here in this distant portrait against a palette of cold gray, she's depicted by Bronzino, but she's not looking at us. Instead, she points to an open book that features two of Petrarch's poems about love. She's quite distant from us. Bronzino doesn't offer us the chance to look her in the eye to understand her further. We're not allowed to get a sense of her personality. As in the dignified portrait of Eleonora, the figures are meant only as objects of our admiration. Interestingly, Laura herself still thought the portrait too revealing, responding to it in writing. As my own new image, lofty work of your skilled hand, discloses my every affection, every thought, my heart would prefer to keep them hidden. Bronzino himself was enthralled by Laura, exchanging poems with her, praising her poetic and moral virtue. He names Laura as his muse and compares her to Dante's muse Beatrice, and Petrarch's own muse coincidentally also named Laura, writing to her, "You, through your own valor, vanquish Laura and Beatrice, and you are above them in worth, and perhaps their lovers in style and song." And so the painter, in painting the poet, aspires to be one. Bronzino's paintings already reflect a preference of poetry over prose. His most celebrated painting is his most sophisticated and also his most controversial. It was a diplomatic gift from Cosimo I to none other than François I. King François was well known for being quite lustful and would have appreciated such a picture for his private viewing, with overtly sexually explicit imagery bordering on pornographic. And in fact, there have been complaints about it being on public display in even more recent times. But Bronzino has actually composed a very philosophical picture with an important moral message under the guise of eroticism. Like Cranach's Cupid complaining to Venus, this allegory depicts the relationship between pleasure and suffering, which often come in a pair. At the center of Bronzino's love story are Venus and Cupid, a problematic couple because they're mother and son, which makes this all the more inappropriate. Cupid provocatively leans in for a kiss, sharing a tender embrace with Venus, his hand fondling her breast. But it's not what it seems, because Venus is actually stealing an arrow from Cupid, who of course is known for shooting arrows to cause people to fall in love. And so she's taking away his primary attribute, which threatens his very identity. And she thinks she's being very clever. She's smirking. Not from the kiss, I think, but from this secret success. Little does she know that Cupid is up to no good either. He's stealthily reaching for her crown. That mutual trickery aims to demonstrate the dishonest and often dangerous nature of a fling like theirs, which Bronzino further emphasizes with a group of theatrical masks in the foreground at the lower right. Those are universal symbols of deception. He's warning us that lustful passion can be a dangerous vehicle for deception. Across the top, we see an elderly man with an hourglass on his shoulder, clearly the personification of time. And he seems to be concealing the scene with a curtain. Or is he trying to reveal it? Because he's tugging the curtain, and on the other hand, there's a masked figure with no head, only an empty shell for a face. Who is this? Fraud, perhaps, or ignorance, because he lacks a mind? We're actually not sure, but in any case, these two mischievous individuals are engaged in a tug of war. Then we see a young boy who naively celebrates the occasion, about to shower these incestuous lovers with rose petals. But he's haphazardly stepping directly on a thorn. We can see it actually piercing right through his foot. That's an allusion to the consequences of fleeting pleasure, and pleasure without forethought. A young girl sits in his shadow, enticing Venus with a honeycomb, an apparent gesture of goodwill. But her hidden form is that of a venomous snake. That tail and those scales that you see behind the young boy's feet are actually hers. She's the personification of deceit. And cleverly, Bronzino has made it so that she's obscured by the boy, leaping forward with joy, completely oblivious to her presence. Pleasure is masking deceit. Notice Bronzino's choice of color and his use of cangiante on her robes. He uses two muted tones of pink and violet, these subtly contrasting shades, to color those robes, suggesting her two-faced nature. The forces of sweet affection and predatory evil coexist in this girl's soul. Now, the leftmost figure has inspired much curiosity. His face is twisted in anguish. He has swollen, disfigured, and it looks as if they're bleeding fingers. He's losing his hair. He's lacking teeth, crying out in agony. These are all symptoms of syphilis, which would have been prevalent in Europe at the time. And they're rendered with remarkable scientific accuracy. Entire papers have been written on how Bronzino has illustrated these symptoms. Could this be a kind of very snarky public health message for the very sexually active King François? Does it serve to ridicule the king's promiscuity, perhaps? Well, clearly Bronzino here is suggesting syphilis to be a natural punishment for foolish and careless lust. So eroticism aside, this is a work of incredible intellectual depth. It's a moralizing work. And that would have appealed greatly to the erudite, sophisticated taste of European courts during this time. And the morally upstanding nature of this work perhaps compensates for its apparent indecency. Mannerism wasn't limited to painting and architecture. There were sculptors and goldsmiths like Benvenuto Cellini here, who translated the exaggerated elegance of Parmigianino and courtly sophistication of Bronzino into the decorative arts. And like Rosso Fiorentino, Cellini was invited by François I to work at Fontainebleau. This object was made for the king to hold salt. It's made out of gold and ivory on an ebony or wood base. We don't actually know if this precious masterpiece was ever used on the kitchen table. It certainly looks like a display piece. It was shaped and hammered by hand. Now the salt would sit in the ship next to the two figures, Tellus and Neptune, the deities of land and sea. After all, by legend, salt was first formed by the interaction between water and earth. And the classical temple on the other side would have held pepper. There's also a collection of terrestrial and marine animals that fill the surface to the brim. You can see the trunk of an elephant peeking out to the left of the classical temple there, behind the figure. There's also a seahorse, horses with webbed feet, and even a salamander, which was emblematic of the king. Cellini's work, like Bronzino's, constitutes late Mannerism. And in this period, we really see artists channeling the exaggeration and expressionism of earlier Mannerists like Rosso Fiorentino and Parmigianino into ornamental sophistication, a new intellectual depth to satisfy the tastes of European courts. Next time, we'll see how the evolving European taste informed the styles of the later Cinquecento, and in turn the next major episode in European art history, the Baroque. See you then. Thank you for watching the narrative art history of the Renaissance.